Welcome, Hollywood, Florida. My name is Mimi Kennedy. I'm on the board of Progressive Democrats of America, but I am here in my function as an election transparency and integrity activist. It's not about telling you who to vote for, but it is finding out the method by which we vote and protecting our vote from the many games being played to steal your vote. And it's happening nationwide. I am so glad. Welcome everybody on the live stream, and who, like I often do, going to watch it on your own time at 1 in the morning so you can educate yourself when you didn't have the moment when it was happening. Right now, my friends in Hollywood, California, one of them I hope is about to win an Emmy. But I am glad to be here, welcome to Hollywood, and doing this very important work, because the democracy of the United States is what allows us sometimes to do what we love, to be with one another and care for one another, and we're going in the wrong direction right now, so I'm here. Okay, I would like first to bring to the microphone the wonderful Andrea Miller, and I'm reading a small print, Executive Director, People Demanding Action, which is a multi-issue advocacy group. She's an organizer, a digital advocacy expert. She's appeared on Thom Hartmann. She hosts the Progressive Roundtable on Capitol Hill. She's the executive producer. I believe that's also on radio, a blog now. I'm not, she'll tell you. She's the executive producer of PDAction Radio. As an IT professional, she's responsible for PDAction's digital strategy. And she customizes our advocacy tools. She's the former co-executive director of Progressive Democrats of America, and she was the Democratic nominee in 2008 for the House of Representatives in Virginia's 4th District. She ran on Medicare for all and clean energy. She understands what can happen in elections. And if you followed what happened in Virginia when it went down to one ballot with a stray mark that tied the race for who would control the legislature and the ballot of power, and the one stray mark made it even, and a coin toss gave the House of Legislature of Virginia back to the Republican incumbents, a coin toss. Okay, Andrea, please, thank you for all your work, and come on up and talk to us.
Thank you, Mimi, and thank you, everybody that's here. As Mimi said, I'm Andrea Miller, and what I'm going to be talking to you about today is voter suppression, my favorite topic. One of the other jobs that I have is I do civic engagement for National NAACP. And one of the things I look at is what is going on in the country with voter suppression so we can work to get in front of it. I have a little presentation for you tonight. My presentation is called the 2018 Voter Suppression Plan. So make no mistake about it, the voter suppression that we are seeing all over the United States is not an accident. It is a plan. It is very deliberate. Next slide. There are 5 main ways that operatives are using to suppress the vote. There's gerrymandering. One of the examples is in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Prior to 2014, you could almost ask any African American in the state, no matter where they lived, who's your congressman? And if they said it was Bobby Scott, they were probably right. They had conveniently figured out how to get the entire African American population of a state pretty much into one congressional district. We're going to be looking at felony disenfranchisement. Florida used to share a very dubious distinction with the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are both lifetime felony disenfranchisement states. Poll closings and DMV closings. We all probably remember back in 2015 when Alabama officially became a photo ID state. So the brilliant concept that they had was, let's close all the DMV offices in the Black Belt. All right. Luckily, that's not mine. Normally it is. So I'm going, that's not me for once. All right. And then I'm sure we all recently read of the threatened poll closings in Randolph County, Georgia, where the plan was to close 70 to 75% of all the polling locations. And of course, they blamed it on a consultant and threw the consultant under the bus. But again, we have not seen the end of poll closings. What we've seen is the end of early announcements of poll closings. All right, voter ID. We're going to talk a little bit more about voter ID a little bit later on in my presentation. Voter intimidation. I've got a great slide for that. And then my big one, voter deactivation and voter deregistration. Next slide. Gerrymandering, we already talked about that. Many southern states have a community of color population of 30%, maybe a little bit higher. There are many states where they have only a single community of color federal representative. And again, these are lines very, very carefully drawn to encompass all the communities of color and put them in one place, seriously diluting the federal Democratic, because normally community of color voters tend toward Democratic, diluting that representation in Congress. Next slide. Felony disenfranchisement. When I ran for Congress in 2008, there were roughly 4.8 million people who were impacted by felony disenfranchisement. Today, 6.1 million Americans cannot vote because of felony disenfranchisement. This is an image directly from the Sentencing Project page. But listen to the racial disparity in this. 1 of every 13 African Americans has lost their voting rights due to felony disenfranchisement laws versus 1 in every 56 non-black voters. Felony disenfranchisement, as I mentioned, there are 4 states, Virginia, Florida, Kentucky, and Kansas. Now, Florida, I congratulate you on Amendment 4. And the Second Chances group that is working to restore voting rights for 1.4 million Floridians. And in Virginia, Governor Terry actually restored voting rights to 173,000 of the 450,000 returning citizens that we have in Virginia. And our new governor is continuing that same policy. There is a problem, though. With the restoration of rights, what we are seeing, those of us who work with the returning citizen population, is that many people, when they get their restoration order, because we call it restoration of voting rights, which is really an incorrect term. It is really restoration of your right to register. Many people do not have that memo that they need to register to vote first. So we've run into that in Virginia with many people who have had their rights restored, not really understanding they have to register to vote first. And now we're also seeing in Alabama and Georgia their laws regarding who is eligible to vote and who isn't after a felony conviction. We are discovering that they have made a conscious decision to not notify the public that the rules have changed. Next slide. Voter photo ID laws. prior to 2010, there really was no such thing. You could go in, tell the person who you were. They pretty much accepted you at face value. Now, in some states, you must have a state photo ID. There's all types of rules about what you can have. Can it be expired? No, it can't. Can students going to a state school use a student photo ID? Every state has a different rule. So there are now organizations, Vote Riders is one of the organizations I work with, and Spread the Vote, that specialize exclusively in helping people understand what photo ID they need and or help people get it. I think as most people in this room know, if you were born in the South, in many southern states, many African Americans could not be born in hospitals prior to the early to mid 1970s. So when we look at rural voters, you may find people who were born at home. If they never worked outside of their local community, they may not have gotten an official birth certificate. Generally, folks don't travel, so there's no passport. So when suddenly there's a law that says you must have a photo ID and these underlying documents are required, people just don't have them, nor do they have, in many instances, the legal means to recreate a birth certificate from 70 years ago. So that's why Vote Riders and Spread the Vote play such a critical role. And you can see, looking at this, I call it the Southernization of America. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, yes, you would expect them to have very strict photo ID laws. Welcome to the New South of Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, all right, Kansas, Utah, and Arizona. Voter intimidation. Yes, it still occurs. We were talking to voters in Nottoway, Virginia. Nottoway, Virginia is about 32 miles south of the city of Richmond. African American voters there were telling us they aren't going to vote in the 2018 election. And we said, well, why aren't you going to vote? And they said, because at our polling locations, which are not in schools, there will be armed militia people standing at the polls. We are a very small rural county. We all know each other. And so I am not going to go and vote. So we're trying to work with that community on absentee voting. But Virginia does not have early voting, but they do have mail-in absentee. So there are still communities where they have to figure out ways around voter intimidation. And a couple of their polling locations are actually in police stations. What are we doing about it? What can we do about it? And how big is the problem? There are close to 50 million people that are disenfranchised this year. Their registration has either been deactivated or they have outright been deregistered by their Board of Elections for any combination of serious sins of not voting, moving and not notifying their board of directors that their Board of Elections that they moved. And the big new one, having an address mismatch between your voting address and a federal database. Normally, I'm good with things like the Postal Service change of address. I'm also good with Social Security survivor benefit. I have a problem when they start following Social Security checks. So what we're seeing is this is really impacting older people. The other problem that we have is political parties, political campaigns normally are only very interested in voters. They're not interested in people who can't vote. So we've literally had to build an organization almost from the ground up that is really working to go out and do the outreach to people who literally are having democracy stolen from them. There are nearly 20 million voters of color who have been deactivated and deregistered. And what we're finding is most don't know. What we want to make certain doesn't happen in 2018 is that we have hundreds of thousands of voters showing up at the polls and only being given a provisional ballot because they're no longer registered to vote. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm getting the card. I'm going to show you just a couple of states and what we look like in terms of numbers. And all this information is pulled right out of the voter file, NGP van. In Alabama, there are 150 seats up for election in 2018. In Alabama, there are 3.8 million eligible voters, 23% are unregistered. When we look at community of color voters, 20% of their African American population has been deregistered, 32% of their Hispanic population has been deregistered. They have a very relatively small Native American population, and 13% of the Asian population has been deregistered. Now, the biggest prize of all, the state of Georgia, with 254 seats up in a single election. We're looking at 33% of the African Americans unregistered, 41% of Hispanic voters, 21% of Native American voters, and 36% of Asian voters. So one of, as I said, my biggest fears, and one of the things that every person in this room really is going to want to think about is, what if they gave an election and nobody could vote? Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea, thank you. And thank you for everything you've done for felony enfranchisement, restoring voting rights. You've been amazing.